Good afternoon, everyone. How are you? Please let me know if you can't hear me well. I'll say what a true honor and a privilege it is for me to be able to come speak to you at UC Berkeley. Most of my time I was sitting in a chair and listening to a speaker, and so it's really great to share with you my experiences both as a researcher and now as a commissioner with the Public Utilities Commission. What has struck me in my last 3 years of public service is that there is a tremendous amount of great work that's happening in our universities as well as in our policy institutions, but we're not having enough conversations between us. And so we don't have that much time today, but I'd like to give you an overview of some of the things that I'm working on and get you to start to think about some of the questions we're asking and encourage you to continue a dialogue with my office, with the PUC. We have a number of forums, workshops, etc., where your expertise could be truly valued. I first came to the commission actually as a graduate student. I was an intern at the Public Utilities Commission, and my first summer of graduate school, and it was a very eye-opening experience for me because I realized that even though I'd only had 1 year in a graduate program at Cal, that I had a real expertise I was building, and I was actually able to contribute to the record and help the division I was working with. And so let me encourage all of you, if you're interested in public service, you don't have to wait till you finish your PhD. Turns out you can do it without one. And please look at government agencies as a place to work in the future. So Carl, thank you for the wonderful introduction and for having me here today. As I learned a bit more about Citrus over the last few months and preparing to come talk with you today, I was really impressed by the Institute's mission to use information technologies in order to address the most pressing environmental and social problems before us. This really aligns well with the CPUC's mission. We try to foster innovation in order to meet our mission, which is to provide sustainable, affordable, reliable energy and utility services. Also, before I forget, I want to say hello to everyone out there on the web. In particular, I hear there is a very dynamic energy storage group watching from Hess Hall. And so thank you for the work that you're doing in this area. And if I get something wrong, shoot me an email and let me know. So hopefully we'll have some time for questions. So I was thinking about information technologies. And when I began to think about it, there's a role for information technologies in all the various sectors that the CPUC regulates. And so there's no shortage of things that we could talk about. But I'm going to focus today on energy policy. And where are we as a state? Fundamentally as a state, we are changing not only the energy resources we are using, but how our energy resources and loads communicate with each other, the grid, and with consumers. As this evolution is more inherently interdisciplinary and multifaceted, we are also working on how we as stakeholders, regulators, researchers, consumers, environmentalists communicate. And so when you're thinking about how we can use information technology, just don't think about how do we make our devices talk to each other. Think about how can we facilitate us communicating. In particular, I'm going to focus today on two proceedings I have, energy storage and electric vehicles. But I'm going to put them in a larger regulatory context so that if you're interested in other areas, demand response, et cetera, you can find some relation. So before I develop further, let me say that I'm only expressing my own opinions today. I do not represent the views of all my fellow commissioners, although the topics I'm talking about are integrated into a host of proceedings. So all of us in some way have some policy role in the things I'll be discussing. So just to give you a little background on the PUC, the Public Utilities Commission is in San Francisco, and we regulate a lot. Privately owned electric companies, natural gas, telecommunications and video franchises, water, railroad, rail transit, and passenger transportation companies. We have over 300 active proceedings, and over $50 billion in revenue annually are from firms directly within PUC jurisdiction. For the electric utilities, we regulate approximately 75% of the state's electric load. and the remainder are in publicly owned utilities like SMUD and LADWP. Information technology that can better measure usage, detect system malfunctions, improve process efficiencies, and facilitate communication between system operators play a key role in all of our regulated sectors. Although, again, my focus today is on energy regulation, I do want to highlight the importance of the ongoing investments that the PUC is making in terms of broadband infrastructure, and particularly in terms of expanding it to unserved and underserved areas. You may not think about this because you're in one of the most technologically advanced universities and one of the most technologically advanced states and countries. But we are still trying to bridge the digital divide here in California. Yeah, I have been humbled by interactions I've had over the last year, meeting Californians who just got access to electricity and still don't have access to wireless and broadband services. Particularly there are parts of our state on the northern coast where these things are still not realities. And I want to bring this up because what we're going to talk about in the rest of the talk here is how we're increasingly relying on telecommunication services to support what we want to do in terms of system management. And it's important to make sure we're empowering all Californians to be a part of that future. We have a program at the PUC, the California Advanced Services Fund, which does provide grants for the build-out of broadband infrastructure in underserved and unserved areas. And there's still significant demand for those funds. So in energy, I'm going to tell you how I'm starting to think about it and really where we're going with our state policy. Our energy policy in California frames a vision for our electricity future that includes an aggressive transition from fossil generation to renewable sources, highly efficient homes and businesses, a flexible and robust distribution and transmission infrastructure, and decarbonization of the transportation system. Our state loading order calls for us to prioritize energy efficiency, demand response, renewable energy, and then cleaner fossil generation in our procurement. Currently, about 25% of our investor-owned utility load is met with energy efficiency, demand response, and renewables. Policies such as AB 32, our greenhouse gas reduction targets, the state's 33% renewable portfolio standard, zero net energy goals, and the governor's zero emission vehicle plan are positioning the state to attain this future. Embedded in this vision, however, is the expectation that California will achieve these policy goals while also promoting greater efficiency, reliability, lower cost, and increased safety. This is no easy task. As you all are aware, these mandates have created new realities and uncertainties within our electric system for us to respond to, such as variable generation, shifting peak demands, and potentially millions more participating in energy delivery. When I started working on renewables at the Energy Commission, we're really focused on could we get to 20%, the 20% target for 20% 2010, and then 33% target for 2020. Now I believe we have the confidence that we're going to get there. But we're also realizing that it's not just about developing renewables. We've got to make sure that the grid is strong enough to take on these new variable resources. California is the nation's second largest producer of wind power and the nation's leader in solar PV capacity. Just to give you some numbers about where we are, the amount coming online is increasing every year. In 2013 alone, 3,500 megawatts of renewable generation capacity was forecasted to come online. That's the biggest year-to-year increase. RPS capacity in 2020, 30% of that is expected to be solar PV. That's a real shift from where we were a few years ago, where the system was dominated by wind. And so that's a different generation profile that we're dealing with. Also, self-generation is increasing. We have over 1,700 megawatts of distributed solar PV that's been installed or is pending, and that's enough power to power approximately 150,000 homes and avoid building 3 power plants. And so although this generation provides many benefits to the state, its intermittent nature presents new integration circumstances for our traditional tools to respond to. The California Independent System Operator, and they're the agency that manages the grid, is responsible for dispatching resources that can balance both load variability and the growing variability from non-dispatchable intermittent resources. Thus, the ISO must increasingly balance supply against a less predictable net load. So what does such a situation require? It requires flexible resources to manage what are the diurnal swings in net load, that come from solar coming on in the morning and the sun going down at night. So we call this integration. How do we balance this? And integration is not a new thing. We've been integrating resources all along. But the scale of the challenge is increasing because now we're having to integrate and balance more diverse resources. We're also being mindful of our commitment to reducing carbon. And as such, we've got to develop tools that are low in carbon. And traditionally, natural gas plants have been our resources for integration. And so we've got to think of something else. So California is pursuing a real mix of solutions to help balance renewables. And one takeaway I want to leave you with is that there is no one perfect solution. I'm going to talk to you about energy storage, but energy storage isn't a silver bullet. It needs to be complemented with some of the other resources that we're pursuing, and those include demand response, energy efficiency, smart grid technologies, regional coordination, better forecasting. And with all of these, to effectively scale these resources so they can be predictably used by the grid operator, we're going to need to improve our analytics and communication software in order to model these preferred resources, their grid impacts, and to integrate them into the existing grid design. If we were starting from scratch, some of these issues would be easier, but we have a lot of investment in the grid we have now, and so we're trying to work with that model, and as the governor likes to say, keep the lights on. Generally, the nature of these resources is requiring us to think differently about how we procure resources. The categories of demand side, supply side are not as clear anymore as we're talking about resources such as demand response and energy storage, and our market rules have to adapt. There's ongoing research that is supporting our understanding of the integration challenge. For example, just to highlight some of the things happening around here, UC Berkeley's switch model is exploring the cost and feasibility of generation, transmission, and storage options for the future of the California system. The California Energy Commission, in conjunction with Lawrence Livermore National Lab, is conducting a supercomputer study on the role of energy storage and demand response in long-term renewables integration. This study uses detailed weather modeling to estimate actual renewable output on a locational basis. And when we're talking about balancing the system, it's not just balancing the system statewide. We really have to make sure that supply and demand is balanced in locally constrained areas. And so in particular in California, we're really focusing on what are the opportunities and resources available to help in Southern California, especially with the unexpected retirement of the Songs generating facility. And as state agencies, we're coordinating our efforts as well to really identify the research and policy gaps. So there have been a number of recent roadmaps that the state agencies have coordinated on, and they give you a really good insight into what our various roles are. And so the California Independent System Operator has been the primary author of these roadmaps, and there's one that deals with energy efficiency and demand response, and another one with vehicle grid integration. The agencies, the CEC, the PUC, and the ISO are now working together on a joint work plan to implement those roadmaps. And so as Carl was saying, as I was saying, I've had the opportunity to lead on our energy storage activities at the PUC. And this is one of the newer integration resources that we're looking at. So I wanted to spend a little bit more time talking about it and how we've used analytical tools in our decision-making process. So storage devices are what they sound like, right? They allow you to take something, put it away, and use it later. It can be batteries, flywheels, thermal energy. Someone who I respect very much in the industry calls it sophisticated Tupperware. And it really, that's what it is, and it's almost remarkable that we haven't figured out a way to finance it and to incorporate it into the grid before. But there's been an alignment of another factors recently, both the need as well as cost declines of technology that are making that happen. So last fall, California, through the PUC, adopted the nation's first energy storage targets for investor-owned utilities. We're asking utilities to procure 1,325 megawatts of energy storage through various solicitations through 2020. Each of our investor-owned utilities has a target, as well as ESPs and community choice aggregators. There was implementing legislation, AB 2514, authored by your Assembly member Nancy Skinner. And as that legislation does, it directs us to consider energy storage for three purposes: renewables integration, greenhouse gas reduction, and the avoidance of distribution upgrades. When we first started working, I came to the PUC in January, and I was assigned this proceeding in February. And it was the first proposal that I put out as a commissioner. And the first reaction, I got a real mix of reactions. And people telling me that the target should be 0 or that should be 6,000. And pretty much people didn't waver from one of those positions. And I didn't know much about energy storage when I started. But the best thing about working on the proceeding was that suddenly companies who had been working on these technologies in their labs started to talk to us. And we realized that there are more technologies that can be cost-effective in energy storage now than perhaps we initially thought. And so garnering support for this target ultimately wouldn't have happened if we hadn't engaged in detailed analysis on cost-effectiveness, as well as had operational data from some R&D projects. But we contracted with Pima and EPRI to do studies of cost-effectiveness, but there had never been studies of this nature done before, at least at the scale that we needed to in order to implement policy. And so they developed simulation tools that were developed and then vetted the assumptions through our stakeholder process. The initial study results are promising. There are many applications for energy storage, but the results found that there's at least a subset where the benefits outweigh the cost. The benefits are greater than the cost. And this was enough for us to feel comfortable with moving forward. The modeling effort, I will say, increased our collective understanding of energy storage, but it's not the final word on cost effectiveness, because ultimately our models were limited by the information input that we had. So, for example, our current models do not cover scenarios that include both customer saving, energy use optimization, and grid performance models. This lack of an integrated model limits the ability to quantitatively assess the feasibility, impacts, and ultimately the cost effectiveness of demand-side energy storage applications. So being able to combine two modeled perspectives, customer side and utility, is a potential area for follow-up research. We're going to have a better sense of truly the operational characteristics of energy storage over the next few years. There are a number of demonstration projects that are ongoing, both in California and nationwide. And acknowledging this, we built a lot of flexibility into this decision so that as new information comes to light, we can adapt our targets accordingly. We're not wedded to a particular year, and we're not trying to get storage in and of itself. It's really about energy management and encouraging the market. And we're starting to see investments being made. And so just to comment on some of the flexibility and how we think about that with a decision. So we set targets, but we set targets for different grid domains. So the utilities are required to purchase energy storage that connects at the transmission system, at the distribution system, also customer side. But we allow them some flexibility. They can transfer some of their megawatts across categories, because ultimately this is meant to help the grid. And so I think our utilities are best positioned to tell us what they need. But we also want to see lots of different types of storage flourish, which is why we have these categories. We also provide flexibility in terms of viability. If projects don't emerge that are viable, then the utilities are able to defer the targets for a future period. The way that the legislation was written, it requires that all the projects be viable and cost effective. And that's a really high bar to meet when you're emerging technology. But I think it also brings me comfort as a ratepayer that the utilities are going to be wise in these investments. And then finally, the thing you have to do if you're trying to have flexibility and you don't exactly know what's going to happen is you build in some time for future review. And so in 3 years, we're going to have a comprehensive review of the program and make any needed adjustments. After the first solicitations, which will happen this fall, we'll also review the solicitation process. The utilities now have their applications in, and if you have any interest in this, you can find our proceeding on the web. So that's what's going on with energy storage, and now I'll switch to electric vehicles, because what's been fascinating to me is that as we're considering how to better manage the electricity grid, the potential nexus with the transportation electrification is exciting. I have the pleasure of serving as the chair of the state's Plug-in Electric Vehicle Collaborative, which is a voluntary partnership between public and private public agencies and private companies and environmentalists, all working towards supporting the EV market. And I think what first started off as a real interest in just the greenhouse gas benefits for the transportation sector and the air pollution goals we're trying to reach, we're discovering that transportation electrification actually can have a lot of benefits for the electric system as well. So there's a number of attributes about EVs which make them attractive, especially as we're trying to deal with renewables integration. They can charge at times when we have excess renewables on the grid. So imagine plugging in your vehicle at work, and that can be charging while the sun is shining, or going home and setting your vehicle to charge at night. It's interesting because a couple years ago, you would never suggest to charge your car on peak. It was always you should charge off peak. But really now we're starting to realize that what is on peak and what is off peak is temporal. And what is the peak now won't be the peak in the future. And so as we're thinking about rate design and incentivizing behavior, you have to do so in a way that's going to be flexible to adapt to this changing load. Also with electric vehicles, the batteries can provide, there are electric batteries in their car, just like you have with battery storage. And so we can see these vehicles providing some of the services that we like to see in terms of demand response and also second life applications for the battery for energy storage. For example, controlled charging allows the utility to use the vehicle for voltage or VAR support to keep the distribution system in balance. So as such as a commission, we started off looking at electric vehicles in a way where we said, let's minimize their impact to the grid. But now we're focusing more broadly about how do we maximize their value to the grid. A great first step in terms of us unlocking this value was the development of the Vehicle Grid Integration Roadmap that was recently released by ISO, and again, another roadmap that we consulted with them on. And this roadmap maps a series of solutions and questions we need to answer in order to see if EVs can participate in grid services. And the intention with vehicle grid integration and the roadmap is to keep customers in the driving seat during the transformation. We get really excited, those who are working in electricity, about everything that cars can do, but the thing they really have to do is drive, right? And so it was very sobering to have a conversation with one of the automakers as we were talking about bidirectional communication and everything like that. And he goes, if it makes a customer, if it adds a little bit of complication to a customer, then it's going to be really hard for us to do. And so, for those of us who are thinking about how these sectors integrate, it's always important to remember, what's the first need that a customer has? Because if they're not willing to participate in selling their service or whatever we want, and then there's no point in coming up with all these rules. And so the vision, again, is that we're looking for a reciprocal relationship between battery-powered cars and the power grid. The roadmap, track 3, I thought y'all would find particularly interesting because it's about supporting enabling technology development. So in this track, details ways to develop enabling technology, including standards to support vehicle grid integration and communication and control requirements. This track also includes testing, measuring, and improving technologies that enhance VGI performance. Standards are interesting. You really appreciate how many standards there are when you try to take on something new. And that's been my experience with electric vehicles, and how important it is to have a common language for all the technologies to be using. And so even though as state agencies we're looking at standards, there's a lot of work happening with the Society of Automotive Engineers, the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers, and the National Electrical Manufacturers. And they've all got processes underway to develop standards governing the safety, testing, and features associated with enabling communications and hardware. At the PUC, we've got a new rulemaking on electric vehicles where we're focusing broadly on policy, but really, again, looking at vehicle grid integration and trying to understand what is the utility role. Most of the technology to support managed charging or bidirectional power flow is still in a research and development stage, but I don't think it's too soon for us to start planning what rules we need around this resource. Our staff issued a white paper on this topic, which is pretty comprehensive, and it lays out 4 key regulatory questions that we need to be considering as a commission. 1, what is the vehicle integration resource location? What's the appropriate aggregator of vehicle resources? How do we capture the distribution benefits? And how do we determine primacy among the grid benefits? And really, we're still starting with that fundamental question: what's the resource here? Is the resource the battery? Is it the driver? And so, having these product definitions will be increasingly important as we try to move forward. So the way we work through some of these things is through pilots. Pilots. So I'm going to let you know about all the different pilots that are happening in probably your own neighborhood, and particularly around vehicle grid integration. So Southern California Edison is testing how controlled charging can be used in a workplace setting. Pacific Gas and Electric is evaluating how vehicles can provide demand response. They also have a Second Life battery project. What's the value of a battery once it leaves an EV? For transportation purposes, you may not want a battery that loses its charges down to 80%, but that could also be useful for a Second Life application. The Department of Defense is engaged in thinking about alternative vehicles, as much from an energy security perspective as well as a grid resource. And so with the support of Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, they're testing how the PEV fleet can provide bidirectional power flow and sell these services into the ISO market. Not surprisingly, much of the research on VGI is focused on the communication technology. So San Diego Gas and Electric's Smart Grid Development Project is investigating the development of standardized communication protocols that can be used to control how EVSEs charge their power and how they're responsive to price signals. San Diego Gas and Electric is also looking at the integration of EVs more broadly with home energy management systems within customers' homes who are participating in the project. And they're going to use some of these field-tested protocols in order to implement new DR and demand response and pricing tariff designs. Pacific Gas and Electric is doing an interesting partnership with Honda and IBM, and they did a pilot completed last year on a cloud-based PEV communication pilot. The pilot project explored an EV's ability to receive and send information and respond to charging instructions based on grid conditions. The goal was to determine if a cloud-to-cloud interaction from an aggregator that interfaces with utility needs and an OEM that has communication structures with EVs can provide reasonably charging schedules that meet the grid needs. And this pilot is going to inform and hopefully facilitate robust third-party participation from EVSPs in our process. That was one of those I really had to read. That was a lot of technical words I normally don't use, like cloud-to-cloud. But it's fascinating to know how much these industries are interacting. And then I'll just end with a recent BMW pilot that's also focused on cloud computing platform for a smart home. And again, they're looking at how do you integrate the communication devices in a home that has EV, that has solar PV, that has energy management system. And taking pilots that are looking at all these resources interacting is incredibly important, because we see the greatest amount of adoption of EVs in homes with homeowners who already have solar PV. And so they're looking to see how to maximize those two resources. Yeah, if you're interested in this space, continue to do research, because the importance of these issues will continue as we're starting to scale. And we are starting to scale the amount of EVs in California. So when the PUC opened its most recent rulemaking on this in 2009, there was one electric vehicle on the market. Now there are 23 light-duty electric vehicles out there and plug-in hybrids available for incentives. There's also been a number of policy initiatives in the last couple of years to promote electric vehicles. ARB, their Resources Board, has a zero-emission vehicle mandate. Governor Brown in 2012 signed an executive order for promoting 1.5 million electric vehicles on the road by 2025. As joint agencies, we're currently implementing a action plan for that target. And then last year, the legislature passed AB 8, which expands state funds for alternative vehicles, fuels, and infrastructure until 2024. And I think we're lucky in California that we do have a legislature that is open and supportive of incentives for clean transportation technologies. And the amount of that fund, I'll note, is about $150 million a year. And it's the biggest fund you'll see from a state in terms of incentivizing alternative fuels, vehicles, infrastructure. But $150 million a year is being invested, but we spend $200 million a day on gasoline in California. So if we're really serious about changing the transportation sector, the scale of investment will need to be more, and it can't all be done by state agencies. And so we continue to work in partnership with private industry. So those are a few examples of how we're continuing to support renewables integration and more broadly leverage information technology. Embedded in this also is a need to address our rate design because many of these resources are going to be responding to price signals, and we want to make sure that we are sending the right incentive. And so we are currently undergoing various forms of rate reform at the Commission to better align our cost and our pricing. And then let me just you wonder, okay, where are we going after this? All this work just to get to 2020. But we're really now trying to figure out what we're going to do in 2030. So AB 32 has a 2020 target and a 2050 target. But to get to 80% below 1990 levels by 2050, we've got to do more. And so the state energy and environmental agencies are currently working together and carrying out analyses to determine an appropriate 2030 target for greenhouse gas reductions. This evaluation will include integrating increasing levels of renewables and transportation electrification. And so as this plan develops in the next few months, I encourage you to follow that progress. It'll be a part of the scoping plan update that ARB is doing on AB 32. But we appreciate that the right combination of policy is needed and active consumer participation if we want to get the response that we need. And we also need you as researchers digging into the data. So towards that end, sometimes I know it can be hard to get the customer level data that you need to test theories and consider different tools. And so the Commission is exploring ways to increase customer and researcher access to energy usage data that can facilitate better energy management while still protecting consumer privacy. And that's always a challenge before us about how do we maintain consumer privacy as we also can appreciate the value of having more data. So there's currently a proposed decision before the Commission which presents a pathway forward, which the Commission will consider in our next meeting. So those are my broad comments. It's a little slice of what I do, and I think we have enough time to ask questions, which is really the fun part. So thank you.
Oh, wait for the mic. Raise your hands, and Yvette and I will. Okay, Yvette's got the first one here.
Yeah. This is the web viewers in here.
Hi.
Hi.
So you mentioned that there was a cost analysis that was done on different energy storage technologies for the grid, and some were determined to be financially viable. Can you tell me which ones? Like, was it thermal or like lithium ion?
So there were 19 different use cases studied, and so batteries, a lot of battery technology was found to be more cost effective at this point. And there's assumptions in there about if you don't have to change the battery, for example, more than twice in a 20-year period. So how often you have to change the battery really matters. The availability of revenue from the wholesale market. And those studies are also available online. But and that's, we set the policy to be technology agnostic, but also acknowledging that there's certain storage technologies that are closer to cost effectiveness now. And that's why we also staggered the targets to be every few years to allow some time for new technologies to come into the space.
Somebody on this side?
Okay. Just wondering if either you as a commissioner or the PUC has a position regarding initiatives like Green Button, which provide broadly based consumer level information, and then with the first intention of informing consumers, but the second one of developing a third-party application market for helping consumers use that information effectively. And are there extensions that might go to vehicle grid integration or driver grid integration?
So I don't think the Commission has a formal position on Green Button, but I'm supportive of Green Button and the opportunity to empower consumers with their information. So I think that's right now, I think maybe one of the only ways that one can access information, and we're looking at ways to expand the opportunities there. In terms of opportunities for vehicle grid, why not? I mean, you think about your electric vehicle, it'll be part of your load profile anyway, but yeah, I don't know what the user interface is going to be like in a few years for all these technologies, but it's been interesting watching, for example, the technology companies like Nest coming into this energy management space and seeing the different approach that they're taking in terms of the product interface. And so I can imagine seeing something like that for EVs as well.
Hi, Ms. Pearson. Hi. I'm wondering, do you have any advice for us students who want to get involved in your kind of work, or any tips for how we could perhaps intern at the CPUC?
Okay, yeah, I can take those in turn. So if you're interested in the work that we're doing, there are so many opportunities to engage and come learn and come talk to us. And we've got a very passionate staff that does this work because they're really interested in it. And I've talked to others who've been in this space for a long time, and they said they haven't seen an exciting time like this in a long time, maybe with PURPA or something like that. But, this is not just merchant generation. This is a real revamp of the system. And so I would say figure out, what area you're interested in particularly and start working on it, because you're going to be at the cutting edge of it. And we're going to be working on everything I said for decades. In terms of interning at the CPUC, there are various ways to intern. There can be graduate. There's separate programs for legal interns versus graduate students. We have a very low capacity to pay, and so I would say I think there's always someone who would take your services for free. But there are also some paid opportunities, and you can feel free to reach out to me if you're interested.
Commissioner, I was wondering if you would comment on what you see in your crystal ball on hydrogen. This year, all the conversation is about electrics. I'm wondering if hydrogen will look more attractive in the future. I think the energy density of gasoline is something like 40 megajoules per kilogram. Hydrogen is up at about 120, and lithium ion is still down near about 1.
Yeah. So I have a couple thoughts on hydrogen. First I'll say that the governor's zero-emission vehicle target includes fuel cell vehicles as well. And I think oftentimes people focus on electric vehicles, but fuel cell vehicles are one form of electric vehicle. And I think we're going to be in a multi-fuel future, both on transportation as well as on electricity. And so I see there being a lot of opportunities for hydrogen. Hydrogen suffers from different challenges than electric vehicles, but it has a lot of potential right now that we may not see in the electric vehicle market. So if you're thinking about longer duration trips, or you're thinking about goods movement and trucks and really getting to zero emission, hydrogen is the fuel that is best poised to do that. What's been interesting about our transportation policy in this state is that we've been focused a lot on greenhouse gas reduction, but there are more stringent ozone standards coming into place in Southern California. And those are actually going to be the binding constraint on what fuels we use, more so than greenhouse gases. And so I don't have the exact number in my head, but I think there's going to be required an 80% reduction in ozone in that area by 2030. And so in that context, truly zero emission, electric and hydrogen have opportunities. And also there's this interesting interface with hydrogen and storage. So I've had the opportunity to visit a few power to gas projects, and those are using renewable energy to create hydrogen through electrolysis process, and then using that hydrogen gas oftentimes as a part of the heating system. But if you think about it, hydrogen gas is just a liquid form of storage. And so ultimately, in the longer term, the economics could work out. In Germany, they're pursuing power to gas more so in the U.S., and I think that's partly driven by the fact that they import 30% of their gas from Russia, and it's expensive, right? So we just happen to have a more plentiful natural gas supply. And then finally, I say stay tuned on hydrogen vehicles. The automakers are planning to bring these vehicles, in terms of wider deployment in 2015. California, the governor's office recently appointed someone to focus on hydrogen station permitting. And so the Energy Commission allocates $20 million a year to hydrogen station development. And so there's a lot of work happening behind the scenes. I think people still think these are cars of the future, but I think they're the SUVs of tomorrow.
Yeah, thank you. I want to ask about coordination, both among the system components and also amongst the different players, the other agencies that you work with. You know, we hear that there's coordination going on, but it's kind of hard to get a sense of what that looks like on a day-to-day basis. So it's great to have you here to hear about that kind of thing. Take EV integration, for instance. You know, you might have a proceeding that's really just looking at EV integration, but then you've got to think about, well, we got to build out the distribution system. It gets back to the core rate making cases. What does it look like? Is there going to be a customer charge? You know, you're clearly not addressing these things piecemeal one at a time. You have to think about them together. And then, you know, whether it's other agencies in the state or in this case, you might have issues of transmission and having to coordinate with the federal regulators. How does that play out?
So, you know, carefully, and everything's becoming increasingly more integrated than it used to be. And I think that my appointment to the PUC from the Energy Commission was an acknowledgement by our governor that we all should be able to work together and fundamentally do each other's jobs, because we're just responsible for prioritizing, you know, one aspect more than others, but we all care about the same things. And so the ISO, their primary focus is reliability, but they do that with an appreciation that power has to be affordable, that it needs to be environmentally conscious. And for us, you know, affordability is a key driver, but we don't think about cost alone. And so coordination happens informally and formally. So the roadmaps are great examples where you realize two agencies have a role, and so let's come together and map something out, and so we can align our proceedings accordingly. The reality, though, is you can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And so if you waited to everything that you would be good to address before you started your proceeding, then you would never get started. And so I look at it like we make a decision. If it needs to adapt, it does. And then also, under this administration, the principals of the various agencies, ISO, Air Resources Board, CEC, the PUC, meet regularly and just talk about what's going on in their respective agencies. And then it becomes really clear when there are subject areas where we need to be working more closely.
Okay, great. Thanks for your comments. I had a question about going back to the cost effectiveness part. So, you know, the numerator and denominator, that, you know, we've got the cost of the technology itself. You don't have a lot of impact over that. But then there's the potential to get value out of that cost. And it seems like when it comes to storage, there are a lot of, you know, it's unclear how they're going to participate in various kinds of markets, how you're actually going to get value for capacity or ancillary services, how much storage will have to, what kind of costs you have to incur to integrate when it comes to telemetry and all these kinds of things. So I would imagine that you have some ability to have an influence over that side of the equation, and I just wanted to know if you could comment on that.
Yes, to some extent, right? And so, as you've noted, it's dependent on partly what's happening in the resource adequacy market, what's happening at the ISO, and within resource adequacy, for example, we approved this past year a flexible resource adequacy target, which is new. And so this is something now that could get a resource adequacy treatment. But the reality is, as we do the first solicitation, and I'll come back to a comment in a second, after we do the first solicitation, we're going to realize what issues need to be improved upon in the various agencies. I mean, what I have found is that the target has really focused people in terms of truly evaluating this resource and trying to figure out quickly how it integrates. You know, we set the targets intentionally in the first solicitation period to be a bit of a stretch over what was already in the pipeline in terms of RD&D projects, and with the targets escalating 25 to 30% every 2 years. And so hopefully we'll have some of these things better figured out in that time. But the ISO is digging in and looking at energy storage. I mean, I think that's the thing. You have to make sure that if you're going to take on something, that the other agencies that have a role are present as well. And what's been encouraging is that we've required Southern California Edison to do a solicitation this year for local capacity in the Songs affected area. And it's a preferred resources primarily solicitation, kind of the first all-in head-to-head competitive solicitation, if you will, which is really exciting because that's where we want to. That's where I want to be. You know, I want all of our resources to be able to compete. It's just they all kind of started at different places, and so you necessarily can't throw them all into the same playpen together right away. But what happened from the first solicitation was that there were over 500 bids that had energy storage as a part of them. And it's been a learning experience, I think, for the project developers as well as for the utilities on everything you can imagine. I mean, how do you structure a contract? You know, is it a contract that's like a DR contract? It has aspects of RA. And so figuring it out.
I think this, we'll take one more question, and it's going to be mine. So my question is that you made your storage decision in the context of an adversarial proceeding. And I'm wondering what you think about doing it that way, and what you would do differently if you could rewrite the rules?
That's a dangerous question, Carl. So it's interesting, just to take a quick step back, we have three types of characterizations of proceedings at the PUC. There's quasi-legislative, there's rate setting, and there's adjudicatory. And depending on the type of proceeding affects how much myself as a commissioner can interact with stakeholders. So the good thing about the storage proceeding was that it was quasi-leg, and so we were able to all discuss matters with each other. If something is rate setting, which is like the storage applications now are, then I cannot have someone talk to me about the decision without it being publicly noticed to all parties to come talk to me. And so I'm really mindful when I come into forums like this to make sure that someone's not intentionally trying to lobby me. But yeah, in terms of what I would change about the process, I think that actually the most challenging part about the system is that we don't get to talk to each other as commissioners. So we have restrictions. You can talk to one other commissioner about an item, an agenda item or an issue, policy or not. And that's in the public interest to make sure that we're not making deals behind the scenes. But as the point was raised, we've got all these different proceedings that are all interacting. And so oftentimes, even though I'm working on energy storage, I don't get to talk as closely to the commissioner working on resource adequacy. And so I wouldn't mind seeing more opportunities for us to talk to each other. And the final thing I'll add, too, is that it's hard to participate in our proceedings. If you're not familiar with the process, it can be a little daunting. We do have intervenor compensation, which allows nonprofit groups to get funding in order to participate, but that is a difficult process to take on if you're not familiar, and so I wish we did have some more forums for exchange. But that being said, I appreciate that our decisions have to be built on a record, and so I think this process, although imperfect, supports that.
Carla, thank you very much. We really appreciate it.